Does Jack Thompson go out at night to solve crimes?
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game controversy to my friends.
My name is John Dukes. I have been a gamer since I was a child.
I'm Elford Stephens. I've got about 35 years of video game enjoyment under my belt. I love just about everything about gaming.
And I'm Phil Thomas. I just got into platform games recently, so you can consider me a video game newbie.
I have a broad question for y'all. What would you say is your least favorite form or genre of media?
It's a tough one.
And how do you define media?
That is up to you. You know, some people say they really, really hate ska music, stuff like that.
Would theater be considered media?
Yeah, that's a medium.
I wouldn't usually have thought of theater as media. It seems that it might be that the definition of media might be broader than I was thinking.
And this could be like a total visceral reaction. I don't like yodeling or something.
Well, I don't like theater. There you go. Hamilton. You can stuff it.
So, Elford, do you mean musicals? Do you mean plays? Do you mean opera?
Yes, except opera. I think I would enjoy opera, although I've never gone to an opera.
I enjoy opera. I mostly like things generally.
Hey, Kev, I'm going to bite off of what you said about ska music. I was in a couple of rock bands in my youth, and I will say that most live rock music is awful. So any place that has like live music or a live rock band, it is generally a place that I do not want to be.
I'm generally pretty easy. I'm with you, John. Unpopular opinion, I actually really like ska. I have a ska playlist right on my Spotify. I never granted that.
It's hit or miss. Like it's like the same thing with goth. Like there's like really bad goth and there's really good goth. You know, it varies.
But the reason I asked that is, so whatever media you have issues with, theater, ska music, whatever, do you think you would ever be a person to lead a crusade against it?
Probably not.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah, I think leading a crusade against rock music in America, that would probably go poorly for me.
So the reason I bring that question up is because the subject of today's episode is going to be a one-man crusader against video games. Actually, this topic is so big, it's not going to be contained by one episode. So this would be the first of two episodes. They're going to cover what some people may consider either the greatest Karen in the history of video games or the greatest nemesis in the history of video games. And those could be the same thing. We're going to talk about Mr. Jack Thompson. Has anybody here heard of Jack Thompson?
I don't recall.
I don't think so.
Wait a minute. Isn't he that singer-songwriter that did all those panty teaser songs in the early 2000s? Oh, wait, that's Jack Johnson. Sorry.
It went under an assumed name.
Please, yeah, he really, really reformed his no. Please keep going, Tim.
It seems to me that maybe pretty much always means no, and music, in fact, is the devil's media. All right, so Jack Thompson's kind of a big topic. He is a very, I'm not going to say polarizing figure, because most people who are associated and like gaming typically tend to hate Jack Thompson, but he's such a complicated figure. And if we consider him a supervillain of video games, what's a villain without an origin story? So the first episode today, we're going to talk about his early life. We're going to talk about what leads him into moral crusading. We're going to talk about some of his early campaigns against media, and we're going to talk a bit about his modus operandi. And that's going to be kind of a foundational piece for when we talk about him next time. We'll actually focus directly on his one-man crusade against video games. All right, let's start at the very, very, very beginning, because John Bruce Thompson, call him Jack, was born in Cleveland, Ohio on July the 25th, 1951. His parents were John and Carolyn Thompson. His father was a sales representative for an industrial paint firm. His mother was a homemaker. Both were conservative Republicans. As an undergraduate, he studied at Denison University in Granville, Ohio, go Big Red, where he earned a bachelor's degree in history and political science. Ironically, that was the same thing I studied when I was an undergraduate. He earned a law degree at Vanderbilt University Law School, and in fact, a contemporary of his was Al Gore. While in law school, he met his wife, Patricia Halverson. And in 1976, they had a pretty big year. They both graduated, they got married, and they moved to Florida. Patricia had gotten a job practicing law. They settled in Miami-Dade County. And while they're there in September 1976, Jack Thompson takes the bar exam for the first time. He fails the first time he takes it. Failing the bar exam hit him pretty hard. And after his failure, he went into something of a depression. For a while, he's doing a lot of soul searching, trying to figure out what happened, what he can do differently. And he eventually found comfort in religion. He became a born-again Christian, became involved with the local Presbyterian church, which was Key Biscayne Presbyterian Church. He even taught Sunday school there. And in fact, he finally did pass the bar exam in May of 1977. Over the next 4 years, he kind of did some low-level legal work at a couple of local Florida businesses. He worked at a computer company in the late 70s where he handled their in-house legal work. He also sold computers over the phone on the side. He also worked as a legal counsel for a local real estate development firm, and he worked as a fundraiser for Christian ministry. And in fact, in 1981, he scored his first job working at a law firm called Blackwell, Walker, Gray, Powers, Flick, and Houle. However, in 1985, he was fired. Thompson later claimed in his memoir that he was fired because, quote, "I had this bad habit of speaking the truth." His coworkers, however, had a different theory. They explained later that he was fired for being stubborn and inflexible. According to a former coworker, quote, "The board terminated Jack because he was stubborn. Personally, I liked Jack's style a lot, but others felt he had personality problems." So Thompson, after he leaves that job, kind of works a little bit for himself. His wife, Patricia, had a fairly lucrative job. I believe she was in corporate law. So he's able to kind of pursue his own kind of legal things. He does a bunch of pro bono work in the mid-1980s, particularly for people who were victims of sexual assault. And in 1985, he scored a pretty big named client by the name of Ileana Flores. Now, this is kind of a wild story, so buckle up. Ileana Flores was a young woman from Honduras, and Thompson is representing her in her divorce case from a guy named Frank Furster. Ileana and Frank had been involved in a really bizarre child abuse scandal in the summer of 1985. They had run a daycare center in Miami where a number of young children had come forward to accuse them of sexual abuse. This is a really complicated case that the details of a lot of it go outside the scope of this episode, so I'll kind of give a really broad interpretation of it. It's not clear whether or not assaults actually took place. There's been some debate over whether the kids were coerced into giving testimony that said that. Some people arguing is that they might have been some kind of occult motivated rituals like blood sacrifices and stuff. You got to understand that in the mid-1980s, there's this huge obsession in sort of the public discourse with the occult and Satanism, what they would have called the satanic panic, which involved fears of abuse at daycare centers. It also involved another side part of it was a real big fear that Dungeons and Dragons was going to be a gateway into the occult and lead people into blood sacrifices and violent crime and murder and all of that. Well, in any case, Ileana Flores and Frank Furster get kind of caught up in this whole thing. And eventually, Furster and Flores are arrested. They're charged with 14 counts of sexual abuse. And during the investigation, the prosecution really leaned on Flores to turn on her husband. And people have argued that they went so far as to use coercive interrogation methods, repress memory things, hypnosis. Like I said, this is a really weird case. And eventually Flores does. She turns on her husband. She recounts a lot of lurid details of the sort of ritual satanic abuse. However, she eventually recants that. Then she recanted her recanting of it. Eventually, Furster was sentenced to 165 years in prison. Flores received a 10-year sentence and was eventually reduced to 3 years, and then eventually she was deported to Honduras. And like I said, when she goes to divorce Frank Furster, Jack Thompson represents her in her divorce.
What kind of child abuse? Was this verbal or physical or something worse?
I believe it was physical and worse, sparing gruesome details.
Oof.
In working in this case, Jack Thompson was inspired to start researching sexual assault and try to see what were the underlying causes that would lead to something so heinous as what was going on here. He felt what he found was a connection between sexual abuse and depictions of that abuse in the media. And with that, Jack Thompson found the cause that would shape the rest of his professional life: obscenity. He was against it. From Thompson, quote, "When I started researching the problem of sexual abuse, I found that one of the causes for it was obscenity, particularly obscenity that portrays people who are sexually abused as enjoying that abuse." And so what we're going to talk about next is how he decides to wage his war on obscenity and the targets he decides to focus on. So let's skip ahead a little bit to 1987. In 1987, Jack Thompson sets his sights on his first target, a Miami shock jock by the name of Neil Rogers. So Rogers is kind of you think of like your typical shock jock. They do like comedy, they do like prank phone calls, parody songs. He had an acerbic personality. He would have it out with people who called over the phone and things like that. And he kind of becomes a staple of AM radio in Miami at the time. The way Thompson learns about him is the way Thompson says it is he was driving one day and he happens to flip on the radio. And this is what he describes. And I'm going to read this right out of Jack Thompson's memoir titled Out of Harm's Way. We're going to go back to that book in a bit. I was driving my car in Miami in the middle of the morning rush hour when I turned my radio dial to one of our local stations. What I heard coming through my speakers was horrible, enough to make a Howard Stern fan blush. Okay, not most of them, but some of them. This radio station was running a contest encouraging young male listeners to send in pictures of themselves, along with the type of sexual activity they enjoyed. The homosexual male host of the morning show would then choose one entrant to join him on an all expenses paid vacation. I've never heard recordings of this, but this is the way Jack Thompson recounted this experience of hearing about this so-called solicitation that Neil Rogers did on his show. And Jack Thompson did not take very kindly to that. But outraged, Thompson writes a letter of complaint to the station, saying his objection to this whole thing he had heard. And Rogers hears about this. And Rogers, kind of an acerbic, over-the-top personality himself, decided to dox Jack Thompson on the air, revealing Thompson's home address and phone number. And so Rogers' listeners begin to harass Jack Thompson. And this ran the gamut from pranks, harassing phone calls, to even, as Jack Thompson recounted, threats of violence. This is from a report from the October 1st, 1988 edition of the American Bar Association's publication, which said, quote, Thompson found a rifle target, shot full of holes, set up on his front lawn. A man screamed obscenities at him and his wife from their front yard one night. Appointments were made for him at urologists, rectal surgeons, and psychologists throughout the Miami area. A realtor came to the Thompsons' house unsolicited and said, I'm sorry, you and your wife are getting divorced and you have to sell your house. So Thompson sued the station. And he also began calling Neil Rogers' sponsors and demanded that they pull their funding. He also made numerous calls to the station and to Rogers himself. And eventually the station countersued. And ultimately, the two sides settled and they dropped their suits. The station agreeing to stop mentioning Jack Thompson on the air. And that's a promise that Neil Rogers almost immediately broke, which Jack Thompson then sued him again. At which point, according to Jack Thompson, he said that the station agreed to pay him $5,000 every time Neil Rogers mentioned him on the air. Now, the station's executives disputed this claim. They said no agreement like that ever took place. But as a result of that, Jack Thompson found a new hobby, which is he began recording all of Neil Rogers' shows and tallied every time that Neil Rogers mentioned him on the air, and claimed that as of August 1988, that his name had been mentioned on Rogers' show 40,000 times. If that was true, he'd be entitled to about $200 million. He sued them again, and there was kind of a debate between the rest of them. And I believe, I don't think anything came of that in particular. And overall, Thompson sued Rogers and the station at least 4 times. In addition to that, Jack Thompson also tried to get Neil Rogers prosecuted. So it isn't just obscenity. He's trying to get him basically thrown in jail. To that end, Thompson wrote numerous letters to the FBI, accusing Neil Rogers of soliciting teenage boys for sex on his radio show, selling pornography to children, and making death threats. He made repeated phone calls and letters to the FBI, to the Florida governor, a guy named Bob Martinez, and the Florida state attorney. Oh, and more about the Florida state attorney in a second. At one point, he even decided to take it even further than that. On September the 18th, 1988, Jack Thompson wrote to the Republican National Committee, pushing them to press charges against Neil Rogers for mocking President Ronald Reagan. He also claimed that they should press charges against Rogers because he made fun of then Republican presidential candidate George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle. So Jack Thompson tried to take this to the manager, so far as to the president of the United States.
Wow. He has motivation, that's for sure.
Definitely persistent.
I wonder what the laws were on the books in 1988 for doxing. It feels like there's stuff that Neil Rogers did that you could be sued for. Maybe not necessarily the stuff he did with his own show, but the stuff he did to Jack Thompson, doxing and other forms of harassment.
It's kind of hard to root for Rogers in the early stages of this. I'm not sure how far he goes in saying, okay, do this and that to him. But the fact that he published Thompson's information over the air isn't cool.
Yeah. Are you allowed to do that?
I'm pretty sure you're not. And he did eventually get fined by the FCC. I don't know. I don't think it was for this, but for something else. He got fined about, I think, $10,000 or $20,000 by the FCC. And he did actually eventually change stations, ended up going up to a different station in Florida.
I will say, in Neil Rogers' defense, Miami's probably a tough place to be a super religious conservative.
You mean Jack Thompson?
Yeah. I mean, if you're hanging out in Miami and you're going to be offended by every single socially liberal thing you hear and see, you're probably going to get offended a lot.
And there was certainly plenty for Thompson to be offended by. So his crusade against Rogers continues. So it starts in 87. Let's skip ahead to the holiday season of 1988. Again, Thompson is calling sponsors. He's trying to get Rogers off the air. He's trying to get the FCC to get involved. He's trying to get the state attorney to put him in jail. He's trying to get the FBI to prosecute him. He's trying to get the president of the United States involved. So in December 1988, Neil Rogers takes part in a charity fundraiser, which he's doing with a Miami shelter for people without housing called Camilla's House. And for this fundraiser, Rogers encourages his listeners to send a donation of $20 or more for the Camilla's House. And he asks them to send a blank tape. And in exchange, Rogers will then send them back clips from his show, parody songs, things like that, as a way of, I guess, like a way of saying thank you for doing this donation. And Thompson didn't really take kindly to this campaign. And in his typical style, wrote numerous letters to Miami-Dade County's state attorney's office, the Federal Communications Commission, and the governor of Florida, Bob Martinez, demanding that they charge Rogers with distributing obscene material through the mail. And my favorite part of this story is in a letter to the state attorney from December 29, 1988, Thompson admitted to ordering one of the tapes from Rogers while posing as an 8-year-old girl. This is a direct quote from Jack Thompson. He says, quote, "I concocted my own private sting in which I sent Rogers a check for $20 along with a crayon letter from a fictitious Amy, 8 years old." And then according to Thompson, Rogers mailed Amy the tape, and Thompson then attempted to use this as evidence that he broke the law.
I mean, the dead giveaway is what 8-year-old in 1988 has $20? You know how much money $20 was? Like in 88, if you told me I had $20, I could buy anything. All the stuff that I would have loved to have bought that I couldn't imagine, like a telescope or a tent or one of those like gigantic Lego sets. You guys know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh yeah. If it was me as a kid, I would have $20. I was into He-Man or Ninja Turtles around those times.
I'm totally buying a mask figure for that, There
you go.
If you're curious, you got me thinking, Phil, and one of my favorite websites on the internet, because I'm a tremendous nerd, is the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, because I like to know how much things cost back then. And $20 in December of 1988 is about $44 today. So little Amy, 8 years old, got enough disposable income to be donating and access to a blank tape to mail this out. So by mentioning the state attorney's office, we mention another person that Thompson then gets involved with in terms of a feud. The state attorney for Dade County at the time was one Miss Janet Reno. Anybody heard of Reno here?
I remember Reno, general attorney of the United States.
Yeah, she was a longtime Florida attorney, and then she eventually became U.S. Attorney General under Bill Clinton.
Right.
So by 1992, she's now the U.S. Attorney General. But at this point, she is the state attorney for Miami-Dade County in Florida. And Thompson sent tons of phone calls and letters to Reno's office demanding that she prosecute Neil Rogers for a variety of different offenses, as we've seen. Now, here's something interesting. According to Jack Thompson's memoirs, he and Reno had a history. According to Thompson, in 1975, when he's first getting ready to move to Florida, his wife gets a job out there and he is looking for work out in Miami. He apparently interviewed at the state attorney's office. And according to him, the person who interviewed him was Reno. Reno interviewed him for this job. This is in his memoir. It's kind of a bizarre passage, which I'll read parts of you. Thompson later fixated on the fact that Reno apparently put her feet up on the desk and says never crossed her legs during their interview. And I got like weird Basic Instinct kind of vibes when he's talking about this.
Sorry, can I see that version of Basic Instinct with Janet Reno? I really want to see that with the Will Ferrell version.
It is Reno time, indeed. Here's Jack Thompson's account of what happens in this interview. And again, it's so strangely worded to me. Miss Reno, wearing a blue flower print dress, pushed her chair backwards, sat down, and put one foot and then the other on her desktop blotter. Her feet were apart, pointed at me, toes up, without either the ankles or legs crossed. The only thing crossed at that moment in that office were my fingers, hoping that Reno would not do the whole interview in this, shall we say, posture. Then it got worse. The interview lasted about 10 minutes, roughly half of which was consumed by a lawyer repeatedly running in and out of her office asking about cases. I was confused. I was a student with next to no spending money. I bought a ticket to fly down to Miami to interview for this job. But Janet Reno couldn't give me 10 uninterrupted minutes of discourse, and even that had to take place between her shoes as if they were conversational goalposts. I felt I was being intimidated rather than interviewed.
I get the feeling that this fella is not a feminist.
Maybe he was intimidated by Janet Reno of his own volition.
I kind of sense something traumatic happened to him a long time ago. The way he's acting, he's just offended by everything or he recreates things in his mind that is based off of a traumatic episode of something. I say that because I've studied psychology and stuff. So it just sounds familiar to me of someone with a history of mental health.
And we'll talk more about his personal style and maybe touch on some of this. I don't know if he has any history of trauma, and I wouldn't presume to say, but he does have a very interesting way of going about things. We'll put it that way for right now.
Yeah.
So according to Thompson, she apparently quizzed him on a couple of legal cases and basically said that they had made this decision at the attorney's office. And it's like, what do you think about that? And apparently by his estimation, she didn't really like the answers he gave. And then she kind of ends the interview. All of 10 minutes ends and he goes out the door. This is what Thompson took away from this. He concluded in his memoirs that he didn't get the job because he was a law and order type and Reno hated the police. Quote, I was relieved after my 10 minutes of pain were up to get out of Reno's garment district, but I was more than a little dismayed that a gung-ho, lock up the bad guys type like me couldn't work in the prosecutor's office in Miami. I like the police, but I think that's why Janet didn't like me.
Is he a commentator for Fox News?
He was for a time. He became more of an expert who would come in to talk about skipping ahead to talk about video games. As far as I know, he doesn't do a regular spot on Fox News, which kind of shocks me. So Janet Reno and Jack Thompson apparently had this exchange in 1975, where he was very, very fixated on her posture and what she was wearing, how she talked to him. When Reno didn't take any action against Neil Rogers, despite Thompson's assertions that they needed to happen, Thompson came up with an idea. He decided that someone else should be state attorney, and that person was Mr. Jack Thompson. In 1988, Jack Thompson announces his candidacy to run for state attorney against then incumbent Janet Reno. Reno, a Democrat, Thompson, obviously a Republican. His platform consisted of two key prongs. The first prong was that Reno was inactive and refused to prosecute Neil Rogers. He even went so far as to insinuate that Neil Rogers' radio station was probably blackmailing her. The second prong.
This guy has. I don't know. I feel sorry for him, like extremely, even though he's just really upfront and it sounds like the world revolves around him so much, and he needs to be at the center of this world in order to control things as he wants them.
I'm curious your thoughts about Thompson when I tell you the second prong of his campaign against Reno.
Go ahead.
He thought that Janet Reno should not be state attorney because she was probably a lesbian.
Well, it's a free country. You can have whatever opinions you want.
So prior to a debate with Reno during this election, Thompson mailed her a written statement on which he asked her to check off one of three boxes. So 3 boxes that Reno could check off that said, quote, I, Janet Reno, is a first checkbox, homosexual, second checkbox, bisexual, third checkbox, heterosexual. Unquote. Adding, if she did not respond within several days, quote, then you will be deemed to have checked one of the first 2 boxes. So he was trying to get her effectively disqualified. Now, she's not part of the LGBTQ community, but he's trying to insinuate that she is. He doesn't have a really great relationship with gay people.
I'm curious to hear more about his family members and his wife's views on him. I'm getting a lot of red flags on. I could definitely see a delusional pattern being formed, based on my opinion. But
I feel like you don't watch Fox News very much, John.
No, I know Fox News, but
I'm actually waiting to hear some QAnon philosophy starting to spring from this fellow.
I'm sure he's into that too.
I'm Jack Thompson, and I'm here to tell you why we should stop the steal.
Yeah.
Because
It's funny you asked that because there was later on an interview where a newspaper reporter tried to reach out to his wife and ask what she thought about Thompson. And she basically said something to the effect of, what Jack does with his own time is his own business. And she would not comment on it. She left him to his devices.
As long as he's putting food on
good
the
woman
table.
right there. It doesn't even sound like he's putting the food on the table. She's been working. He's been writing letters to people.
I am positive that Mrs. Thompson was the primary breadwinner in the Thompson family. She secured a pretty good corporate law job in Florida. That was the reason they moved to Florida in the first place.
Right.
And it seems like part of the reason he was able to wage this campaign is because he had the time to do so.
Yep.
Yeah.
After he gets fired from that firm where I said he was being stubborn and inflexible, his initial offices were basically operating out of his own house. So I think what happened is that he was in a position financially where his wife was providing most of the money, where it's not as much of a pressure on him to do so. That's my assessment of that, I think.
Well, my opinion is that Mrs. Thompson should dump his ass and get with a winner like Janet Reno.
I'll bet zero and get yourself a hero.
Yeah, I heard her name's getting tossed around the White House.
So like I said, he sends this letter to Reno asking her to basically to check off her sexuality, using it as a disqualifying feature in his campaign. And so at the debate, Reno, knowing this, went up to Thompson and put a hand on his shoulder and said, quote, "I'm only interested in virile men. That's why I'm not interested in you." At which point Janet Reno grabbed a mic, dropped it, and walked out.
Wow. Yeah. There you go.
And Jack Thompson, thus publicly chastened, sincerely apologized to Janet Reno, and he promised to conduct himself better in the future. I am just kidding. He's filed battery charges against her.
Oh my God, really?
He tried to
For
charge her with battery.
Did the battery shoot out of the microphone and hit him in the face? Is that what happened?
So basically, he tried to argue that when she put her hand, she assaulted him. And so because this was during an election, because she was the prosecutor, the county brought in a special prosecutor to litigate this. And they threw the case out. They basically said this was a politically motivated charge, specifically because she was a political opponent. And Thompson ended up losing in a landslide. He lost by about 60% of the vote, is what I've heard. However, following his defeat, Thompson, undeterred, would continue to write letters to Reno's office, to Governor Bob Martinez, and to the FBI, even conducting his own investigations into Neil Rogers. So he continued to write to this office, even though he could not be the state attorney, but you're going to work for me and you're going to take care of Rogers for me. One of the things that's interesting about researching Jack Thompson is because he's a lawyer and a lot of his stuff involves litigation, a lot of his stuff is in the public record. And someone gathered, and I don't know who this did, but thank you, kind citizen, put together a GitHub account with a folder that has all of these records that Jack Thompson sent to the feds. So all this stuff is publicly available and stuff. And when I put together the show notes, I will include it. It's really cool to read. They don't mention Thompson by name. All of his stuff is like blacked out and redacted. But after you've read his stuff enough, you can tell his authorial voice.
Yeah.
You can hear his specific kind of care and energy that he's got.
I see all caps in his writing.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I had to look up what the term virile meant. And I have to say that a picture of Russell Crowe from Gladiator popped up. And if Janet Reno said that about me, I would feel so bad about myself. I would be hurt. Oh, man.
Direct concentrated assault on Jack Thompson's manhood.
If she said, "Elford, you're just not a virile man," I'd be like, what am I doing with my life? Oh, man.
I feel like I would fall apart in my composite materials at that point.
Hey, Kev, what's his relationship with drugs and alcohol? Did he use them? Was he against them?
That's a good question.
Okay.
As far as I know, Jack Thompson has no history of substance use. He doesn't seem to have a public stance on it as far as I can tell. Now, I could be wrong. His focus is more on obscenity as a cause of society's ills. That being said, he was, again, playing the percentages. He was a conservative Christian Republican, that he might have objected to it. But at the same point, he was also a self-professed libertarian. So it's possible that maybe he wasn't that concerned with it. I don't know. Why don't we talk about his next target? Let's skip ahead to 1990. He sets his sight on a new target, the rap group 2 Live Crew.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Any Two Live Crew fans among the
Oh
group?
boy.
So what I know of Two Live Crew is I believe their concerts were getting a little out of hand. If there was good food for Jack Thompson, it was when he went to the Two Live Crew concert and enjoyed himself too much.
Didn't they get arrested for performing a show?
We're going to talk about that.
I know NWA did. They got like beat up by the police during the show. Oh, my Two Live Crew.
All right, so we're going to take a trip back in the history of rap and hip hop history to 1989, a year before this, when Two Live Crew releases their album As Nasty as They Want to Be.
Boy, yep.
And As Nasty as They Want to Be becomes a sort of hotbed for controversy. People are concerned with the explicit sexual nature of some of the lyrics. And I am not here to comment on that. I haven't really listened to much of Two Live Crew. That becomes a hotbed of controversy in specific parts of the country, namely in Jack Thompson's stomping ground in Florida. In February of 1990, the Broward County, Florida Sheriff's Office launched an investigation into As Nasty as They Want to Be on the grounds of obscenity, trying to argue that this album was obscene. The Broward County Sheriff obtained permission from a judge to warn local retailers that they could be subject to arrest if they sold the album. So just by carrying it, a record store seller could be arrested for obscenity. And this triggered a legal battle, unsurprisingly. And on June the 6th, 1990, a Florida judge ruled the album was obscene and said it was okay to press down on people for obscenity like this. And on June the 8th, 1990, they got their first arrest. A guy named Charles Freeman. Charles Freeman was the owner of a local record shop called EC Records, which is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And he was arrested and charged after selling As Nasty as He Want to Be to an undercover cop. Several days later, on June the 11th, 1990, Broward County Police went to Club Futura, which was a nightclub in Hollywood, Florida, where Two Live Crew was performing. And they arrested Luther Campbell and Christopher Wong of Two Live Crew, charging them with violating a prohibition against obscene, lewd performances. Among one of the most vocal opponents of Two Live Crew, Mr. Jack Thompson. Reportedly, Jack Thompson first heard about As Nasty as They Want to Be from his local rap music book club. No, that's not real. He heard about it from a conservative talk radio host from Florida, a guy named Mike Thompson, no relation to Jack, who apparently received the lyrics from a media watchdog group called the American Family Association, which is kind of like a fundamentalist Christian conservative media group. And they apparently heard it from a different conservative media watchdog group called Focus on the Family. So Thompson finds out about these lyrics and is certain that they're obscene. And this goes into his campaign against obscenity, particularly the sexual content in it. Goes back to his initial impetus, the idea that he's concerned that there's a connection between sexual violence and sexually explicit content in the media. So Thompson calls for retailers to pull the album or limit access to only adults. There was a warning sticker on these, so there were certain restrictions on it. He argued that the album encouraged or glorified sexual assault. In a practice that would be common later on for Thompson, he set up his own sting operation into As Nasty as They Want to Be. He sent a 16-year-old boy, whose 16-year-old kid I do not know, it wasn't his kid, into several Florida record stores to buy copies of As Nasty as They Want to Be and their single Me So Horny. And then he called the cops on them and filed complaints against the retailers.
Oh my God.
He did his private sting operations.
Wow. How about that? Not surprised, by the way.
He also liked to write letters. Yeah. Again, to Florida Governor Bob Martinez, to State Attorney Janet Reno. But again, he sends tons and tons of letters out to the legal authorities to come down on these naughty, naughty lyrics and these naughty, naughty albums, calling them to prosecute Two Live Crew. And he, being a lawyer, also files litigation. You know what's funny about Thompson? When I was in college, I interned at a couple of local representatives' offices. One was a state representative, and at one point when I was my senior year, I interned at a congressman's office. In every district, anyone I think who works in local government, particularly when you're doing constituent casework, so where you're interacting with people who live in a given district, there's always a Jack Thompson. There's always somebody will go out of their way to send lots of phone calls and lots of letters and lots of emails about various things they have problems with. People calling about having specific issues. And what do you personally plan on doing about it?
So my question is, does Jack Thomas have a posse?
Does Jack Thompson have a posse?
Yes.
He very famously, and this goes out for the remainder of his professional career, did it as a one-man thing. He would not affiliate himself with organizations. I'm paraphrasing. He later said that he wouldn't affiliate himself with a specific organization because then you get saddled with all of their baggage. And then that baggage can be used against you to discredit you.
Wow.
So he's a lone wolf. He wanted to make sure that what you knew was from Jack Thompson's noodle. It didn't come from anybody else.
I'm not surprised. He just
It
seems
was
like a man.
probably a rule for him to get invited to the parties. Say, Mrs. Thompson, you're not going to get invited again if your husband mentions our group.
Okay, Jack. This is the third time we've had this ASI book club. We're talking about The Great Gatsby, not about whatever your bullshit is. You have been warned.
And he'll probably
I just want to say
well,
nope.
he's like, well, if I'm being warned, I'm going to sue.
This book is obscene, and I'm going to sue you.
Yeah.
Dear Janet Reno, they yelled at me at book club.
Yeah.
Call the police.
Maybe it was a little reverse psychology pulled by Mrs. Thompson. So he was like, honey, which organization should I align myself with this week? And then she remembers every single organization she knows told her, keep our organization's name out of your husband's mouth. And she just looked at him and said, well, you don't need to, honey, because you're so virile that you're a lone wolf. He's like, I am a lone wolf.
He's the original Maverick. That's me. I don't need no organization. Right, honey?
Jack Thompson is the first and last angry man, you know? All right. But this campaign that he did in Miami against Two Live Crew is the first thing that really propels Jack Thompson into the national spotlight. He gets a lot of national press attention for this because some argue that he is the reason why these obscenity things get pushed to Two Live Crew, that a lot of this is pushing. And of course, he also takes credit for that too. As a result, throughout 1990, he appears on national TV shows like Nightline, CBS This Morning, Donahue. He received a feature article in the Los Angeles Times. He even got to publish an editorial in Billboard magazine. In June of 1990, he appears on the national talk show Donahue, I suppose, a guy named Phil Donahue, which probably some of you of a certain age might recall.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
He shared the stage with Luther Campbell, the lead guy from Two Live Crew, and accused him of encouraging, quote, the mental molestation of children and the physical molestation of women. He also claimed the majority of people buying as nasty as they want to be were children. He throws out a number, says 1.3 million copies have been sold at this point, and the majority of them are to children, which is like, how do you back that up? Like, where is that data? It could be that you're just pulling this from the ether, you know?
Yeah, definitely has.
Luther Campbell of Two Live Crew had a theory about why Jack Thompson chose As Nasty As They Want to Be as his target. And he felt like it didn't necessarily have anything to do with obscenity. Instead, Campbell was a native of Miami and was also a vocal supporter of the state attorney, Miss Janet Reno. In fact, Campbell even wrote a song about Janet Reno in supporting her that he called Janet Reno in 1989. Campbell accused Thompson of just basically, you're targeting me because I'm a supporter of Janet Reno and you've got this long-standing rivalry with Reno. With that in mind, do you want to see a video of Luther Campbell yelling at Jack Thompson?
Yes.
Yes.
Kevin, while you're pulling that up, can I just say that the song, it's not a Two Live Crew song, but it's a Luther Campbell song. Can I say that the song Doo-Doo Brown was the soundtrack of my childhood? That song was playing all day, every day, out loud on my block. So like just the idea that, I mean, I can understand how somebody would protest a song, but it was kind of like the fabric of society for a couple of years there, at least in my neighborhood.
Before I show you the clip, I thought I'd at least show you a picture of what Thompson looks like. And so what I have on the screen, this is a picture of Jack Thompson in 1990. Anyone want to describe what they say?
Straight up conservative dude.
Yeah. What's fascinating about Thompson is like, picture a middle-aged white conservative. Just picture that in your head. And I feel like Jack Thompson is that. All right, I'll play like a minute or two of this. This is from a June 1990 episode of Donahue with Luther Campbell, a couple of other representatives of the music industry, one person from Focus on the Family, and Jack Thompson. Interestingly enough, maybe strategically enough, Luther Campbell and Jack Thompson are at the opposite ends of each other on the stage. So Luther Campbell talking now. You'll know Jack Thompson. He's kind of a nasally voice, so you know when he's talking.
Yeah. He has 2 albums, though.
That's right.
He has a clean album and a
That's right. And
this is a free country, and we have the right
I've got a
to
right
listen to whatever. And
I don't think I was. Hey,
Phil.
Phil,
right
we
to
appreciate
what
very
his
much
child
the
listens
enthusiasm.
to.
Please,
Luther
Phil, let me
doesn't
point
want
out.
his child
Let me point out.
Hang on, Wendy.
Phil, I don't think
Let Luther
I
make this point. You don't let your 7-year-old listen to your own work, right?
It's my job as a parent
To make sure your baby is exposed to whatever you want him to listen
to
to
the
and
clean
see in here.
version.
Okay.
That's why I do 2 versions.
Mr. Thompson has a right to make his point.
Okay,
Sir, go ahead.
But the thing is Mr. Thompson is misleading these people.
All right, you'll
here.
have a chance
Mr.
to
Thompson
straighten.
don't even have an office.
All
I
right.
mean, he's a crazy man. Mr. Thompson is about to get disbarred because he's a crazy man. He's barred from radio
He is a crazy man.
in Dane County. You
All right.
say Neil Rogers.
Phil,
Say Neil Rogers. I bet he can't say it.
Let him make a point.
Let him say Neil Rogers.
All right.
Phil,
Say Neil Rogers.
Phil,
You
so-
wanted to make your point.
Yeah, so that you don't get sued. Let me point out that the Florida bar said to me that I'm so concerned about obscenity and so concerned about the sexual abuse of women that I must be crazy. So we sat down and we agreed to have a psychologist and a psychiatrist examine me. And you know what they said my problem was, Luther?
What was it?
They said absolutely nothing. The only problem with Jack Thompson is he's a Christian concerned about women and children.
Okay. While we're at it
And
here.
let me point out, Phil, these people don't believe
Why
in
you
the fruit.
single us out?
Yikes.
Hold on, Jack. Why did you single us out? Why
these
haven't you
people-
talk about these groups right here?
These people don't believe
Why haven't you talked
I'll
about
tell you one.
Yikes.
I'll tell you one
Why haven't
reason.
you talked about the X-rated video?
I'll stop it there. Later, Luther Campbell says, "You're at me because you wanted to get at Janet Reno." That's a little bit of the old Jack Thompson flair there. And we'll talk about the assertion he said about his mental state in a little bit.
I mean, but did you see Jack Thompson's face when Luther brought up the fact that he was about to get disbarred? He was like, "Ooh, you got me where it hurts."
I can't get over it. Says, say Neil Rogers, which suggests maybe there was some sort of agreement where he could not mention Neil Rogers anymore because of all the lawsuits they were having with each other.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So I will say that Luther Campbell and the rest of the Two Live crew, the folks that were arrested, they were acquitted in October of 1990. And the obscenity ruling against as nasty as they want to be was eventually overturned in the U.S. Court of Appeals in May of 1992. So they found that this violated First Amendment grounds. So this got thrown out. And
Which
I
is
bring
funny
up,
because that's what supports his right to keep harassing people, is his First Amendment right.
So I bring up these episodes, Neil Rogers, Janet Reno, and Two Live Crew, to give you some insights in a bit about his style and how Jack Thompson wages his moral crusades. He really does, at least from researching his stuff, seeing his stuff on video, reading what he's put together, reading his legal cases, he really does view this as a crusade. He sees this as a spiritual battle between himself representing the forces of good and decency and the forces of evil. This is a Manichaean good and bad, black and white, good versus evil battle for him. And it says a lot also about where he sees himself in these campaigns, because he views them in David and Goliath terms. He's the little guy. He's the last voice of decency. And he's battling, these big forces of evil. He's battling the media corporations. He's battling the radio station leaders, the people who support Neil Rogers. He's battling the record industry who's publishing this obscene material. And that he is this heroic figure who stands alone. And that idea, again, that he doesn't connect himself with any specific organizations and does his own, helps serve that. It's a personal one-man crusade. He's a one-man army against the forces of obscenity. More than that, more than even as David, he views himself as Batman. And I mean that in some cases a literal way. In an interview with Los Angeles Times, they noted that in his in-home office, he had a big poster of Batman on his refrigerator. He wears a Batman watch. And the most interesting point, while crusading at Two Live Crew, he sent legal documents out along with a copy of his driver's license with a photo of Batman pasted over his own picture.
Oh, fascinating. This man is so fascinating.
Layers. He's like an onion. He's got layers to him.
He's got so much going on.
Does Jack Thompson go out at night to solve crimes? Is that why?
Costume vigilante by night. What would he fight it? What would you fight at night? I'm really curious what Jack Thompson as a costume crusader would fight.
I assume he would go to a stand-up comedy place, and every time the comedian made an obscenity, he would just stand up and yell, "Clean it up!"
He's just got like super heckling powers.
Yeah.
No, clean that up. Clean that up. No. 7 things you can't say on television. Let's add a couple extra ones to that.
Wow.
Here's something he told a Los Angeles Times reporter in 1990, quote, Batman is just a metaphor I use to explain why what I've done has been received so well by some people. For me, the appeal of the Batman lies in the fact that he was supposed to be a private citizen who was able to provide assistance to his government, a lone activist who helped authorities do a job that they seemed unable to accomplish on their own. And my question to you all is, he's a lawyer. He is licensed to practice law in Florida. What do you think about a lawyer who closely relates to someone who explicitly operates outside of the law?
John, can I go back to a point you made earlier? There are probably a lot of unintended allusions. Batman probably resounds with Jack Thompson on a number of different levels. Batman is someone who is trying to work through his own trauma and guilt over the death of his parents, which he feels responsible for, and is basically taking that out on all of the criminals in his city. So the thing I'm thinking of is, wait a minute, let's go back to that first child abuse story that you mentioned, Kevin. And the question is, what happened there? What's the trauma that he encountered there? What's the guilt that he feels? And how is that driving him on this crusade?
That's a good point there, Phil. My thought is he's clearly delusional, and he may have some resemblance of the Batman that we know, but I also think it's twisted in a version of himself. So it's a good point, but I think it's hard for anybody to understand what he's going through with that. So it may be correct in some degree, but I think it's more than just that.
And this comes up a lot, the fact that Thompson has a very specific view of where his role is in the world and what his relationship to these crusades he has. And again, he's got a very, very, very high opinion of himself in these. And going along with that is he picks himself as a hero. And what's a hero without a nemesis, without a villain? And a lot of Thompson's crusades are characterized by a nemesis, someone he targets specifically as sort of the embodiment of this evil he is fighting. And to that point, he described Luther Campbell as the Joker. He said, quote, he's peddling obscenity to children, and that's why I have to play Batman here, to assist, to cajole, and to sometimes embarrass the government into doing its job. Like the Batman, he's got this sort of robust rogues gallery. We've seen a couple of them so far. We've seen Luther Campbell. We've seen Neil Rogers. We've seen Janet Reno. And the other thing is they're not just opposing psychologies. They're not just opposing viewpoints to Jack Thompson. Whereas like he is normalcy and Christian morality and, quote unquote, traditional family values and all that stuff. And they're representing this sort of obscenity. He also views them as having a very, very personal vendetta against him. It's not just that they're this opposing viewpoint. They are actively out to destroy him. He often views his enemies as having the same kind of personal vendettas that he does. So, for example, in a March 4th, 1989 letter to Janet Reno's office, as we established, one of many, many, many letters that Jack Thompson sends to Janet Reno, he accused her of disclosing information about his ongoing investigation into Neil Rogers without telling him. That he's asking, what have you done to prosecute Neil Rogers? And they're not telling him anything. And he claims that she reached out to somebody else to talk about this case, and that he attributed that kind of slight to her still being mad over the election, saying, quote, can you explain why your office will discuss an investigation with a stranger to the process in violation of your office's gag rule, and yet not discuss its status with the one person who has brought the evidence of the criminal activity to you, namely the underside, me, Jack Thompson? Old animosity for pointing out to the electorate your ongoing nonfeasance? So basically saying that she's not telling them stuff because he called her out on not doing anything about Neil Rogers. Also, like Batman, he takes a really, really aggressive stance to his foes. Thompson fights his enemies, and this is true in these early campaigns, and we're going to see this when we turn to video games. He fights his wars on two fronts. One is in the courts. He's a lawyer, he's taking litigation, but the other is the court of public opinion. And his legal battles are frequently accompanied by aggressive public relations battles. This includes media blitzes, are characteristic of him. He will inundate the press with letters and later emails, phone calls, press releases. He'll also launch verbal and written attacks against his opponents. He'll send relentless messages to them. For example, that same 1990 Los Angeles Times report that featured Jack Thompson during his fight with Two Live Crew observed Thompson was known to send, quote, relentless phone calls and faxes, some as early as 6 a.m. or as late as 11 p.m. I also will point out as an aside, and we'll see this a lot when we talk about video games, that he also has a habit of often flourishing them with accusations of various heinous crimes, and occasionally seasoned with some good old-fashioned childish name calling. And so what Campbell is referring to is people reporting Jack Thompson for harassment, including people like Neil Rogers. Here's an example of one. During his crusade against Rogers, like I said, he's reaching out to sponsors, people who are partnering with Rogers, people who are helping with charitable fundraisers, like the thing for the Camillus house, like the thing where he posed as an 8-year-old who got the tape and tried to report him to the police. He got into a heated exchange with a local minister who was trying to push to get out of doing fundraisers with Rogers. Thompson called the church out for their involvement and expressed his displeasure. And in a letter dated December 16, 1988, Thompson wrote the following, quote, "You taunted me at the end of our call by saying, 'I will pray for you,' which is the classic Christian put down. You also graciously labeled me a nut." After this exchange, the church reported Jack Thompson to the state attorney's office, citing him sending them harassing phone calls. He also sent harassing phone calls to his nemesis, Neil Rogers. In fact, after one such phone call by Thompson to Rogers, Thompson alleged that one of Rogers' bodyguards threatened him with violence if he didn't stop calling, saying that the bodyguard, quote, "could turn people into a pretzel."
Wow.
And he reported this threat in one of many letters to Florida Governor Bob Martinez. For example, in one court appearance with Neil Rogers in November of 1988, Jack Thompson and conservative Florida talk radio host Mike Thompson, who I mentioned a little while ago, was probably the guy who introduced him to Two Live Crew. These two guys, Mike Thompson and Jack Thompson, followed Neil Rogers and his lawyer out of the courthouse. This is from a quote from the Florida Sun-Sentinel, that he followed them out of the courthouse, quote, "barking insults while dozens of passersby watched in amusements. The two Thompsons made loud sexual comments and criticized Rogers' lawyer's intelligence." Jack Thompson, as always, a paragon of maturity.
And delusion, I think.
On February the 6th, 1989, Jack Thompson mailed a newspaper article from the January 26, 1989 edition of the Miami Herald to Reno's office, again, one of many, many letters, reporting how the local branch of the NAACP was pushing for the FCC to deny a license renewal to the station that was carrying Rogers' show for racially inflammatory material, he was saying. And in this newspaper article that he mailed to Reno, he wrote on the side of the article, "Janet, this is your fault." And in another letter to Reno, he speculated she was failing to press the investigation against Rogers because, quote, "Is it because children don't vote, Miss Reno?" And like I said during the campaign, he went so far as to accuse Janet Reno of not taking action against Neil Rogers because the station was blackmailing her. You kind of get a sense that he has a habit of bombastic, inflammatory, attention-grabbing statements. Some of them could even be interpreted as threats of violence. So, for example, in his editorial for Billboard that I mentioned, sort of nationally printed publication of the music industry, on October 6, 1990, Thompson called out the parental advisory labels, indicating that they were inadequate and ineffectual, so they weren't working. And he threatened the recording industry at large with litigation and that there would be some kind of parental backlash to them. Or as he put it, quote, "Either the record industry labels start differentiating between what is obscene and what is protected by the First Amendment, or the government will make the distinction, which might make real artists, not so subtle, dig the Two Live Crew, the next victims of obscenity. An industry that says a line cannot be drawn will be drawn and quartered. All your clever lawyers cannot erase the consequences of distributing obscenity to children whose parents are appropriately armed for revenge." This is a lawyer saying this.
Oh, man. This guy.
When he says armed, what is he referring to?
He leaves it up for interpretation.
Oh.
Sounds very American.
Please interpret this for me, because I'm too crazy to think.
So he's very quotable, as you can see, and he knows how to get press coverage because he is trying to push people's buttons and making these inflammatory statements and making these things that can be perceived as threats. Another writer for Billboard who commented on the editorial that got published in October of 1990 wrote in the December 8th, 1990 edition of Billboard that he described two motivations for Jack Thompson: pissing people off and compounding his own celebrity. And all of this led then to lead some people to question his mental stability. As we saw, Luther Campbell called him a crazy person. And in 1990, the Florida Bar Association, after receiving numerous complaints about Thompson from people like Rogers and his station and from places like this church where the person called him a nut, actually had him conduct a psychiatric evaluation. They had him meet with a psychiatrist to assess his mental state. And according to an article in the August 11th, 1990 issue of Billboard, quote, "The Florida bar announced earlier this year that no cause for the allegations of instability was found by a psychologist." So that's what he's referring to when he says in the clip that I was evaluated by a psychologist and they said that I'm perfectly healthy and normal and my crusade is okay. And in fact, Jack Thompson later joked that he was, quote, "the only officially certified sane lawyer in the entire state of Florida." He did acknowledge some character flaws, telling a Los Angeles Times reporter in 1990, saying, quote, "I still have a few major personality flaws to work out, but I'm not crazy. I have to work on tolerance a lot, anger and impatience with God and others. Sometimes these things get me into trouble." But I will say that Thompson, to his credit, took the psychiatric evaluation by the Bar Association and the threats of disbarment. I will say he was not disbarred during this point. He took the psychiatric evaluation with good nature, grace. He kind of rolled with the punches. I'm absolutely kidding. He sued the Florida Bar Association. He claimed that they had it out for Christian conservative lawyers such as himself. In fact, in his memoirs, he compared his treatment by the Bar Association to a lynching. He said, quote, "I felt I had just come through an attempted high-tech lynching of an uppity Christian. It was the worst thing I had ever been through." The court ultimately awarded him damages in $20,000 when he sues. And for years, Jack Thompson asserted that the Florida Bar Association left that case determined to have their revenge. And that is where we're going to leave our story for right now. Because next time what we'll do is we'll skip ahead a little further in time to the crusade that would define a lot of Jack Thompson's public life, would lead to him ascending to his highest levels of exposure and press publicity, but would also ultimately lead to his downfall.
Hey, Kev, do you know what the psychologist or psychiatrist tested him, what kind of test they used to evaluate him?
I have no idea. The only reports I've heard of, as far as I know, the Bar Association psychiatric reports aren't public records. I wouldn't assume that they would because of confidentiality.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, the only thing is that they said they cleared him, that they didn't diagnose him with any condition.
That's unsettling. Oh my God. I definitely see a personality disorder.
Any other thoughts about Thompson, where we've gone so far?
Wow.
If Jack Thompson is Batman, then his nemesis are the obscene Penguin, naked Catwoman, the pedophile Joker, and the Riddler with Tourette's.
I like what you said before that Jack Thompson was the original snowflake.
There you go. What I think is interesting, and we'll probably get into this more in the next episode, is that he clearly sees, whatever his biases are, he clearly sees that technology is going to lead and make more available something that a certain segment of society does not want to see more of. And he thinks it's obscenity in video games. But the irony is that what we should be wary of in terms of emergent technology is people exactly like him, internet trolls, 4chan, QAnon, people who dox others because they share views that are different than them. He thinks that the danger of emergent technology is other people. The danger of emergent technology is people exactly like him.
I think that's a good point.
Something to think about. I think Duke's brought up just understanding what's going on in the rest of his life before family, marriage, and all that stuff. What I heard today is this man has ideas and perspectives of the world, and he is willing to push and push and push towards them. Sadly, history decides who's right or wrong, and there are people who do the same thing and change the world. He didn't, and so there's reasons for that, and I'm thinking I'm going to learn what that is. He's not wrong about everything. He just has an opinion, and he's definitely very, very pushy. And when I meet a character like this, I want to know what's going on with the rest of one's life, right? We kind of dwelled on that a little bit before, in that maybe he has a lot of free time, right? And maybe, I tend to put a lot more weight into somebody who is working hard, taking on their responsibilities, and still has something to say, versus somebody who has an excess of opportunity to continue to spout their judgments on everybody else. I am more curious to learn the full picture of who the man Jack Thompson was. I'm not very familiar with him or his history and his influence on the video game industry. I'm glad, though, that there were no video games about him, because he was around when I was first twiddling my thumbs, and I don't think he had very much effect on my Legend of Zelda game.
Yeah, same.
There are some places where maybe Thompson had some kind of impact on video games, though not in the ways he anticipated or intended.
And Kev, he was never able to hold a job, right?
As far as I know, from this point onward, from when he loses that job at that legal firm, he is effectively self-employed. I believe after this, he basically sets up his own legal firm, which he operates out of his house. I think he eventually sets up offices. For the most part, he's self-employed after this.
Okay.
We see that's another way. It's just like Batman. None of them has an actual job.
There you go.
You remind me, Elford, of that old saying, how idle hands are the devil's playthings.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to wrap things up on a high note for this episode. And I thought it was kind of fun doing the game last time we did this, that I've got a new game for us, which I'm calling Thompson's Tips. I mentioned a while back that in 2005, at the height of his public presence, Jack Thompson published his memoirs. I have a copy right here. It's called Out of Harm's Way, One Man's Relentless Crusade to Topple Media Giants and Save Your Kids from Video Game Madness. So again, going back to our talk about like where he views himself relative to these things, the sort of David versus Goliath, Batman versus the Joker kind of terms. I bought this used on Amazon, and I happened to flip to the opening page, and look what I found.
Wow.
Thanks.
My copy is autographed by Jack Thompson.
Oh,
What does the inscription say?
I'll withhold the name. It says, "Thank you for being here, encouraging me," and his cursive isn't great. Something our nation in love. Jack Thompson, dated November 14th, 2009. So here's what the back of this book says. Since 1988, crusading attorney Jack Thompson has been putting himself into harm's way to keep us and our children out of it. Despite death threats, media taunts, and attempts by big corporations to bully him into silence, this unlikely, not always likable crusader is leading the charge against violence and obscenity and entertainment. So what I'm going to do is, so at the end of this book, it has several appendices. Thompson offers what he calls his, quote, 25 culture war tips from the trenches, saying, if you want to be a culture warrior, even after reading this book, then I have some advice for you on how to do it. These tips are things I have learned along the way that, at least for me, have heightened the chances of success. What we're going to do is I'm going to read you some of Jack Thompson's tips for success,
Okay.
and you need to decide if it's a real one or a fake one.
Oh, nice one. Okay.
And so what I'll do is I'll read a statement, and in the spirit of what we're talking about a lawyer who eventually connects to video games. So you're going to buzz in by saying the catchphrase of arguably the most famous video game lawyer of all time, Mr. Phoenix Wright, the ace attorney, by yelling, "Objection!" All right, we all set?
Yep.
Statement number 1, trust no one.
Objection. That's
Still.
a quote from the X-Files.
What do we think? Do we think this is a real tip or a fake tip?
No, it's a fake tip. That's from the X-Files, right?
It's also one of Jack Thompson's tips. It's tip number 17. And here's the copy that goes with the quote. Trust no one. Well, trust no one in the media, at least. Their first loyalty is to themselves, to their news organizations, and to their biases, not necessarily in that order. Assume that everyone in the media is lying to you unless he or she proves otherwise, in actions as well as words. The failing CNN and New York Times. All right, so that's statement number 1. Here's statement number.
I'm sorry, I don't think that statement is relevant anymore. Did he write that book back in the 90s or in the 2000s?
He published this book in 2005.
See, now, if he had written it in 95, there may have been some truth to it. But by the late 90s, the conservative media has pretty much taken over television. And at this point, those comments don't make any sense anymore.
It could be argued that conservative media has carried that to its logical conclusion, because it's like all of the media is biased. Don't trust anybody except for us. Buy our stuff. Buy our InfoWars brain powder.
More people watch Fox News than any other news. I mean, so if you're not trusting the media, turn it off.
One of the fun tricks of people in the establishment is convincing people that they're not in the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that something that a lot on Fox News is like, we're telling you the real stories, the stories that mainstream media will report on, despite the fact that they're technically mainstream media too.
Every time I visit a different patient, there's a television in their waiting room, and it's most of the time it's on. And I made the comment just either this week or last week to a fellow. I said, and more than half the rooms, people are watching the news. And this must be one of the most dominant forms of entertainment these days, that during your time of anxiety, you would choose to watch the news. I didn't tell him that most of the time it is, in fact, Fox News. But nevertheless, it sounds like in the beginning, he may have been a champion in the beginning, in the late 80s and 90s when he first started. But by 2005, now he's not really, this is no longer a siren call. The conservative media had won, and now this is just nonsense.
All right. So statement number 2, eat a healthy lunch.
Objection.
John.
I think it's false.
Yeah, this one's fake. It's good advice. Overall, it's good advice, but it's not one of Thompson's trademark tips.
So the reason why I said that, because it didn't sound like him at all. He's very like, when he talks, it's all about him when he talks. You know what I'm saying?
No one eats a better lunch than I do.
Yeah, exactly.
Mainstream big lunch has been trying to control my thoughts. All right. Statement number 3. Highlight corporate hypocrisy.
That sounds
Objection.
like something he would say.
Yeah, that sounds true.
Did you want to buzz in that, Elford?
Buzz.
All right. What do you say?
I think that is something he would say. 100%.
That is
corporate hypocrisy.
That is definitely something he said. So yeah, highlight corporate hypocrisy is tip number 13. Quote, for example, any company that is a foundation for kids and yet is marketing or selling pornography or other adult material to children is suffering from corporate schizophrenia. Point out things like this.
That's probably a reasonable thing to say.
Here's my concern about those things. It's like often these kinds of, particularly these sort of conservative moral crusades, they tend to frame them in language that no one would necessarily reasonably object to. To give a parallel example, it's like, I just want integrity in our elections. But often the argument for that is, I feel this election was taken by fraud, and that means maybe that certain people who are allowed to vote now shouldn't vote anymore. Like it's almost what seems like an innocuous statement that covers up something a lot more menacing. So it's like, it's easy enough to say we need to protect the children. Literally no one is arguing against protecting the children. But I don't know if you can find an instance of a company that is directly selling pornography to children. Like it's offering an objection against something that doesn't exist.
Right. I don't personally think he's that sinister enough to construct like thoughts like this idea. I think he's really just sick.
All right. Our final one, know your enemy and know your leader. Leader in capital letters.
Objection.
John.
It's his statement.
That is correct.
Yeah.
This was the final one. This is tip number 25. This one's rather long, so I'm only going to read the first paragraph of this one. Again, leader, capital letter leader. Obviously, he means the man upstairs for him. Know your enemy and know your leader. Yes, there are fleshy representatives of that enemy, but the enemy in chief is Satan himself. He is brilliant and more clever than you. Beware of him and his methods. They are frightening and they are real. That is why we are in great peril when we do this kind of ministry, and it is a ministry. It is spiritual warfare. Satan is trying to lead the precious souls in this world astray. This is life and death for him. We are in the way. Like I said, he views this as a legit crusade. It's a spiritual war for him. Spiritual warfare in his own words.
So is there anything on what his spiritual views are? Is there a quote of that in anywhere, Kev?
He's a conservative. He's a Presbyterian, I believe.
Has he talked about it, like written about it?
Like his spirituality or like his religious beliefs?
Yeah, I want to know more about that. That'd be interesting to know, to see. I want to see like how he views religion and spirituality, if it's possible.
He does speak a lot about it. He's pretty open about his faith in particular.
Yeah.
He's a born again Christian. And there are some certain sects of Christianity that believe the only real Christians are born again.
Right.
And he views his work as evangelical, like he's spreading this word. And the way he's spreading that is through, protecting the innocent children and things like that. Mm-hmm. And often uses these terms of like thinking of himself as a representative of God to defend, the impressionable people from these sort of corrupt, godless industries.
You mean he's like a angelic Batman, basically?
Basically, yeah. He is a Batman.
If he's Batman, I bet his Batmobile is like a seafoam Toyota Tercel.
To the Tercel, the Thompson Tercel. Have you ever heard of Bibleman?
No, I've heard it before.
I keep seeing these at like outlet stores, these videos for this superhero called Bibleman. Apparently there are tons of videos of. I'm going to look up Bibleman for you. Was an animated TV series. It was a live action TV series. Let's have a look at Bibleman. And I wonder if this is like one of those Left Behind kind of things where it's kind of insidious propaganda in the sense of like the villains are scientists and I don't know. Did you look it up, Bill?
So like the villains are scientists and who else?
I don't know if this is the case, but I wonder if it's like one of those insidious Left Behind kinds of things where the villains are all like people who don't identify with Christian conservatism, like, scientists and musicians and things
scientists, like that. Environmental conservationists,
people of other religions.
Minorities.
Wow.
There you go.
There is an image of Bibleman now in the chat.
So how does he fight crime? With like passages and...
Let's see what the old Wikipedia says in terms of his powers.
What's his powers?
I'm just looking at the names of his rogues gallery.
Dr. Decepto.
I called it Dr. Decepto. His main enemy is a scientist.
Nice.
Madam Glitz. According to the Wikipedia, she was placed inside a TV set by God. So I guess was punished by God this way. We've got the Fibbler, who sounds like an extremely inappropriate Batman villain.
Yeah.
The Gossip Queen, something called Luxor Spawndroth, which sounds like a bad Dungeons and Dragons character.
Yeah.
Ludicrous.
Which I can only imagine is the rapper Ludacris.
I was thinking that too. I like the wacky protester.
I just saw that.
That's a fun one.
Oh my God.
Ah,
A
protest.
goofy blue-skinned demon scientist.
Nice.
That's our second scientist, in case you're keeping track.
Professor Snortlinscoff, a mad scientist.
We've got Rapscallion Polite Sinister, the villain.
Too cool for school.
Yeah, too cool for school.
Wait,
Am Wonderful.
Look further down the list. Barack Obama. Huh. That's weird. A little ahead of its time. No, I'm just kidding. That's not.
There he is, the commandant of confusion.
I wonder what his relationship to the Sultan of Selfishness.
Wait a minute. This looks like a description of me.
I want to know what his powers are.
No powers.
So this had 49 episodes. Wow. I wonder what it aired on.
PAX. I actually have no idea where this aired. But yeah, I kept seeing these at like outlet stores, like people trying to unload these things. Because, how are we going to connect to the kids? What are they like? They're like superheroes.
I'm reading about Cypher, his black sidekick. Cypher manages the lab's communication system and assists Bibleman with tactical and technical support.
Black sidekick.
Yeah.
Oh, lightsaber.
They always put us in technical support. He has a lightsaber.
I just searched Bibleman powers, and according to Google, it's superhuman strength. As well as superhuman strength, Bibleman is equipped with a powerful suit of armor, which he terms the full armor of God. He also appears to be armed with a weapon which resembles a lightsaber, for when fighting becomes the only available option. His power is he's clothed in the righteousness of the Lord. And so, yeah, somehow this has turned into a Bibleman podcast.
You should do an episode on Bibleman.
I'm sure Bibleman had a video game somewhere. So next time we'll focus on Jack Thompson's personal war against video games, but also gamers' war against Jack Thompson.
It was cool.
I thought it was cool too. Thanks so much for hosting, Kev, as always.
And that'll do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. Be sure to like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to us. Check out more information about the show on our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com. Our theme song is Occam's Seek We by Seek Knowledge, used under a Creative Commons BYNC SA 3.0 US license. Link to their music through Free Music Archive is in the description. And on behalf of Elford Stephens, Phil Thomas, and John Dukes, I'm Kevin Impellizeri saying thanks for listening and see you next Scandal.